I need to tell you something that happened to me 11 days ago that's going to sound absolutely impossible, but I swear on everything I hold sacred that every word is true. I was sitting alone in my car outside a coffee shop in Nashville at 1:30 a.m., having just walked away from the most emotionally destructive conversation of my adult life, when Jesus appeared in my passenger seat and revealed the shocking truth about toxic relationships that's been keeping millions of people trapped in cycles of spiritual and emotional abuse. What he showed me didn't just free me from a relationship that was slowly destroying my soul. It gave me the keys to help others recognize and escape the toxic patterns that masquerade as love but are actually forms of spiritual warfare. But before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps give me the strength to speak my truth. Now, let's get into my story. I'm recording this from my hotel room in Nashville, where I've stayed an extra week since my encounter because I literally cannot process what Jesus revealed about toxic relationships without having space to absorb the magnitude of how this wisdom changes everything. It's 2:45 a.m., and I haven't slept more than 4 hours straight since that night. Not because I'm tormented, but because the freedom I've experienced from understanding healthy boundaries has me so energized about helping others break free from their own toxic patterns. Let me tell you how the most manipulative relationship of my life led to the most liberating encounter with divine wisdom I've ever experienced. The crisis began 8 months ago when I met someone I'll call Rebecca during a Christian conference in Dallas. She approached me after my presentation about faith and authenticity, and from our very first conversation, I was struck by her apparent spiritual depth and passionate commitment to ministry. "Jonathan," she said with tears in her eyes, "your portrayal of Jesus has helped me through the darkest season of my life. I feel like God is calling me to work alongside people like you, to help heal broken hearts and restore damaged faith." Her words hit me at exactly the right moment. I had been feeling increasingly isolated in my ministry, surrounded by people who saw me as the Jesus actor rather than as Jonathan the person. Rebecca seemed to see both my calling and my humanity in ways that felt refreshingly authentic. Over the next few weeks, we began what I thought was a beautiful friendship centered around shared ministry vision and mutual encouragement. Rebecca would text me daily with Bible verses, insights about spiritual growth, and what seemed like genuine concern for my well-being. "I've been praying for you," became her constant refrain. "God showed me that you're carrying burdens you don't need to carry alone." At first, her attention felt like a gift from God. Here was someone who understood the unique pressures of public ministry, who seemed called to provide the kind of spiritual support I hadn't even realized I needed. But gradually, subtle red flags began to appear that I dismissed because they were wrapped in spiritual language. "Jonathan, I notice you've been spending time with people who don't really understand your calling," she would say about my longtime friends. "God's been showing me that He wants to surround you with people who can actually support your spiritual growth instead of holding you back." When I defended my friendships, she would respond with hurt and concern rather than anger. "I'm only sharing what I'm hearing in prayer. Maybe I'm wrong, but I care too much about your spiritual well-being to stay silent when I see potential stumbling blocks." Her concerns always sounded reasonable, even loving. But slowly, I began to feel guilty about relationships and activities that had previously brought me joy and stability. "I've been having dreams about your ministry," she would tell me during our increasingly frequent phone calls. "God is showing me that He has such incredible plans for your future, but there are people and situations in your life that are limiting what He wants to do through you." The conversations always left me feeling unsettled, but unable to pinpoint exactly why. Rebecca never made direct demands or issued ultimatums. Instead, she used spiritual language to create a constant sense that I was somehow falling short of God's best for my life. "I don't want to overstep," she would say before delivering particularly cutting observations, "but I love you too much not to share what I'm sensing in the spirit." 3 months into what I still believed was a healthy spiritual friendship, Rebecca suggested we collaborate on a ministry project a series of podcasts and speaking engagements focused on authentic Christianity and breaking free from religious pretense. God has been showing me that we're supposed to work together, she explained with the kind of certainty that made questioning her feel like questioning God himself. I think you've been looking for someone who truly understands your heart for ministry, and I believe I'm the person he's prepared to partner with you. The idea excited me initially. Rebecca was intelligent, articulate, and seemed to have a genuine passion for helping people grow spiritually. But as we began planning our collaboration, her behavior became increasingly controlling. I think we need to be very careful about who we associate with during this season, she told me during one planning session. God is doing something so pure through our partnership, and we can't let other people's agendas or jealousies contaminate what he's building. She began expressing concerns about my manager, my spiritual director, and even my co-stars from The Chosen, always couched in spiritual language, always presented as loving protection, but consistently aimed at isolating me from my existing support system. I'm not saying they're bad people, she would clarify when I pushed back. I'm just saying that God is calling us to a level of purity and dedication that might be threatening to people who are more comfortable with compromise. The manipulation was so subtle, so wrapped in apparent spiritual wisdom, that I began to doubt my own perceptions. Was Rebecca actually being controlling, or was she genuinely hearing from God about obstacles to my spiritual growth? Jonathan, I've noticed you get defensive when I share spiritual insights about your relationships, she said during one particularly tense conversation. That defensiveness might be evidence that there's truth in what I'm sensing that your flesh doesn't want to acknowledge. This became her pattern. Any resistance to her observations was reframed as spiritual immaturity or unwillingness to hear hard truths from God. She created a dynamic where agreeing with her felt like obedience to God, while disagreeing felt like rebellion against divine guidance. 4 months in, Rebecca began making increasingly dramatic claims about receiving prophetic revelations concerning our relationship and ministry partnership. God showed me last night that he's been preparing us for each other for years. She told me during a phone call that lasted until 3 a.m., not just for ministry partnership, but for something deeper. I think he might be calling us to consider a romantic relationship as part of his plan for our shared calling. The suggestion caught me completely off guard. While I had grown to appreciate Rebecca's apparent spiritual insights and ministry passion, I had never felt romantic attraction toward her, but her framing made questioning the idea feel like questioning God's plan. I know it might seem sudden, she continued, but I've been praying about this for weeks, and I keep getting confirmation that God wants to unite us, not just in ministry, but in every area of life. When I expressed uncertainty, she responded with hurt and spiritual concern. Jonathan, I'm worried that you're allowing fear and past relationship wounds to block what God wants to do. Sometimes we have to trust his plan, even when it doesn't match our natural inclinations. The conversation left me feeling manipulated but unable to clearly identify how. Rebecca hadn't demanded anything or issued threats. She had simply presented her romantic interest as divine revelation and my hesitation as spiritual resistance. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. Rebecca began having dreams and visions about our future together, always presenting them as messages from God rather than expressions of her own desires. I saw us leading ministry together as husband and wife. She would share with tears of apparent spiritual emotion. God showed me that the resistance you're feeling isn't coming from him, it's coming from the enemy who wants to prevent the powerful ministry we could have together. The gaslighting was sophisticated and relentless. Every doubt I expressed was reframed as spiritual attack. Every boundary I tried to establish was interpreted as lack of faith. Every attempt to slow down the relationship was presented as disobedience to God's timing. I'm beginning to wonder if you're really as committed to following God's will as you claim to be, she said during one particularly manipulative conversation. It seems like whenever he asks you to trust him with something that challenges your comfort zone, you look for reasons to resist. 6 months into the relationship, I realized I had become isolated from most of my longtime friends and advisors. Rebecca had successfully positioned herself as my primary spiritual counsel while systematically undermining my confidence in every other relationship that might offer alternative perspectives. "I love how close we've become," she would say with apparent affection. "It's beautiful that God has given us each other so we don't have to rely on people who don't really understand our calling." But instead of feeling loved and supported, I felt trapped and monitored. Rebecca expected constant communication, immediate responses to her texts, and detailed explanations for any time spent with other people. "I just worry about influences that might pull you away from what God is doing in your life," she would explain when I pointed out her possessiveness. "I care too much about your spiritual growth to be casual about protecting our relationship." The breaking point came 7 months in, during what Rebecca called a spiritual retreat, but what felt more like an intensive indoctrination session. She had organized a weekend at a remote cabin where we could hear from God together about our future ministry and relationship. From the moment we arrived, Rebecca began a relentless campaign to get me to commit to both a romantic relationship and an exclusive ministry partnership that would require me to distance myself from the chosen and my existing professional relationships. "God is calling you to a higher level of commitment," she insisted during hours of what she called prayer and discernment. But what felt like psychological pressure: "He's shown me that you'll never reach your full potential while you're divided between multiple ministries and relationships." When I expressed concerns about the dramatic changes she was proposing, she responded with a combination of hurt manipulation and spiritual intimidation. "Jonathan, I'm heartbroken that you don't trust what God has been showing me about us," she said through tears that felt calculated rather than genuine. "I've given everything to support your ministry and spiritual growth, and now it feels like you're rejecting not just me, but God's plan for your life." The conversation escalated into hours of circular manipulation where every concern I raised was dismissed as fear, every boundary I tried to establish was labeled as selfishness, and every attempt to slow down was characterized as disobedience to God. "I'm starting to wonder if you've been using me this whole time," she said with devastating emotional manipulation, leading me on spiritually and romantically while never intending to fully commit to what God was building between us. By the end of the weekend, I felt emotionally shattered and spiritually confused. Rebecca had managed to make me feel guilty for not reciprocating feelings I'd never been given space to naturally develop, responsible for disappointments based on expectations I'd never agreed to meet, and disobedient to God for resisting a relationship I'd never felt called to pursue. But something in me finally snapped when Rebecca made one final manipulative attempt to seal her control over my life. "Jonathan," she said with apparent tears and spiritual authority, "God showed me in a vision last night that if you don't fully commit to His plan for us, you're going to lose the chosen, lose your ministry platform, and spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been if you had just trusted Him enough to obey." The threat was delivered as prophecy, the manipulation wrapped in spiritual language, but the message was clear: submit to her demands or face divine punishment for disobedience. That's when I finally recognized what had been happening to me for 8 months. This wasn't love, it was spiritual abuse. This wasn't God's guidance, it was human manipulation using religious language. This wasn't healthy relationship, it was toxic control masquerading as ministry partnership. That night, I told Rebecca I needed time and space to pray and think without pressure or influence. Her response revealed the true nature of our dynamic. "I can't believe you're choosing fear over faith," she said with anger that finally dropped the mask of spiritual concern. "I've invested 8 months of my life trying to help you become the man God wants you to be. And this is how you repay that sacrifice?" The guilt tripping continued for hours, but for the first time in months, I could see it clearly for what it was: manipulation, control, spiritual abuse wrapped in religious language and delivered through claims of divine revelation. I left the retreat early and drove straight back to Nashville, where I had been scheduled to speak at a conference the following week. But I was so emotionally devastated and spiritually confused that I couldn't imagine how to process what had happened to me. Sitting in my car outside a 24-hour coffee shop at 1:30 am still reeling from 8 months of systematic emotional manipulation. I felt like I had escaped something that could have destroyed my soul, but I also felt incredibly alone and confused about how someone claiming to serve God could use spiritual language to cause such damage. That's when I did something I'd never done before in quite this way. I asked Jesus directly to help me understand how to recognize and respond to people who use faith as a weapon rather than a gift. Jesus, I said aloud in my empty car, I need you to help me understand what just happened to me. I need you to show me how to recognize the difference between healthy spiritual relationship and toxic manipulation disguised as ministry. I need wisdom about boundaries, about love, about how to protect myself and others from people who use your name to control and manipulate. The parking lot was quiet except for the distant hum of late-night traffic and the soft glow of streetlights. I felt like I was sitting at the intersection of freedom and confusion, grateful to have escaped, but uncertain about how to move forward. Help me understand, I continued, my desperation growing with each word, how to tell the difference between conviction from you and manipulation from others. Show me how to have healthy relationships that honor you without becoming trapped by people who use spiritual language to justify toxic behavior. The silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility. And what I didn't know was that my honest question about recognizing and escaping toxic relationships was about to be answered in the most transformative way imaginable. Because at exactly 1:47 a.m., the atmosphere in my car began to change in ways that would give me the wisdom to help not just myself, but countless others recognize and break free from the spiritual manipulation that destroys souls while claiming to save them. The moment I finished my desperate prayer about toxic relationships, the air inside my car became charged with a presence so compassionate yet powerful that I immediately felt both completely safe and absolutely seen. Not the overwhelming divine authority I'd experienced in previous encounters, but something that felt like the perfect combination of wisdom and gentleness, exactly what someone recovering from spiritual manipulation needed to experience. The dashboard lights didn't flicker, but everything in my car began to glow with a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate understanding rather than judgment. And then, sitting in my passenger seat, as naturally as if he had been riding with me all along, was Jesus. His presence radiated such profound empathy that I immediately understood. He had witnessed every moment of the manipulation I'd endured, had grieved every boundary that had been violated, had felt every confusion I'd experienced when spiritual language was used as a weapon against my soul. Jonathan, he said, his voice carrying both the authority of absolute truth and the tenderness of someone who understood the unique pain of being spiritually abused. Thank you for finally recognizing what was happening to you and having the courage to walk away. Now, I can show you the wisdom you need to never be trapped by toxic relationships again, and to help others recognize the difference between love and manipulation disguised as ministry. I could barely speak through my relief and exhaustion, but I managed to whisper, Jesus, how did I let this happen? How did someone claiming to serve you manipulate me for so long using your name? His expression held such understanding that I felt like he had experienced this kind of betrayal personally, because my beloved son, the enemy's most effective weapon, isn't obvious evil, it's twisted good. The people who cause the most spiritual damage are often those who use my name, my words, and my authority to justify behavior that is completely opposite to my character. He gestured around my car, this safe space where I'd finally found clarity after months of confusion. The first truth about toxic relationships is that they always use spiritual language to justify ungodly behavior. Rebecca wrapped every manipulation in claims of divine revelation, every boundary violation in expressions of spiritual concern, every control tactic in language about God's will. As he spoke, I could suddenly see the past 8 months with perfect clarity, how every red flag had been disguised as spiritual insight, how every manipulation had been presented as divine guidance, how every violation of my autonomy had been framed as God's plan. The second truth about toxic relationships, Jesus continued, is that they systematically isolate you from other sources of wisdom and support. Healthy spiritual relationships encourage you to maintain multiple sources of counsel and accountability. Toxic relationships work to become your only source of spiritual input. I realized how perfectly this described my experience with Rebecca. She had gradually positioned herself as my primary spiritual advisor while systematically undermining my confidence in every other relationship that might offer alternative perspectives. But how do I tell the difference? I asked. Rebecca seemed so spiritual, so committed to God's will. How do I recognize manipulation when it's wrapped in religious language? Jesus smiled with the warmth of someone excited to share liberating wisdom. The third truth about toxic relationships is that they create confusion rather than clarity, anxiety rather than peace, and compliance rather than growth. My spirit always brings clarity, peace, and freedom to grow into who I created you to be. He began to show me comparison after comparison how Rebecca's spiritual insights had left me feeling confused and uncertain, while genuine encounters with God always brought clarity and peace. How her pressure for immediate decisions contrasted with God's patient invitation to grow at a healthy pace. The fourth truth about toxic relationships, Jesus said, his voice taking on the authority of absolute truth, is that they demand immediate obedience to human interpretation rather than encouraging patient discernment of divine will. Rebecca constantly pressured you to act on her revelations without giving you time or space to seek confirmation from other sources. I thought about how uncomfortable I'd always felt with Rebecca's insistence that her dreams and visions required immediate response, how different that felt from God's typical pattern of confirming important direction through multiple sources and peaceful conviction over time. The fifth truth about toxic relationships is that they use shame and guilt as primary motivational tools, while healthy relationships use love and encouragement. Every time you expressed concern or resistance, Rebecca made you feel guilty for disappointing God rather than encouraging you to seek His will through prayer and wise counsel. The contrast was stunning. Genuine spiritual relationships had always encouraged me to bring my questions and concerns to God, while Rebecca had made questioning her insights feel like questioning God Himself. The sixth truth about toxic relationships, Jesus continued, is that they claim exclusive access to divine revelation about your life. Rebecca constantly presented herself as having special insight into God's will for you that you couldn't access directly through your own relationship with me. I realized how this had gradually undermined my confidence in my ability to hear from God personally, making me dependent on Rebecca's interpretation of His will rather than developing my own spiritual discernment. But Jesus, I asked, how do I know when someone is genuinely sharing spiritual insight versus using spiritual language to manipulate? His expression became more intense as he prepared to share the most crucial wisdom. The seventh truth about toxic relationships is that they always elevate human authority over divine relationship. Healthy spiritual counsel always points you back to your direct relationship with me, while manipulation tries to make you dependent on human interpretation of my will. He showed me scene after scene from my relationship with Rebecca, highlighting how she had consistently positioned herself as the essential mediator between me and God's will, rather than encouraging me to develop my own capacity for spiritual discernment. The eighth truth about toxic relationships, Jesus said, is that they use your spiritual desires against you. Rebecca knew you wanted to serve me faithfully, so she framed every manipulation as obedience to my will and every resistance as rebellion against my plan. The insight was devastating and liberating simultaneously. I could see how Rebecca had weaponized my genuine desire to follow God, using it to justify demands that had nothing to do with His actual will for my life. The ninth truth about toxic relationships is that they create trauma bonds disguised as spiritual connection. The constant cycle of pressure and relief, disappointment and hope, spiritual highs and crushing lows. All of it was designed to create emotional dependency that felt like deep spiritual connection. I understood now why breaking away from Rebecca had felt so difficult despite recognizing the manipulation. The relationship had created artificial intensity that my soul had mistaken for genuine spiritual depth. The 10th truth about toxic relationships, the most important one, Jesus said, his presence now filling my entire car with indescribable freedom, is that they can only trap you when you don't understand the difference between human manipulation and divine guidance. But once you understand how I actually communicate through peace, clarity, confirmation through multiple sources, and respect for your free will, you become immune to spiritual manipulation. He leaned closer, and I felt overwhelmed by the love and wisdom radiating from his presence. Jonathan, I never manipulate, pressure, or use guilt to motivate obedience. I never demand immediate responses to complex decisions. I never isolate you from wise counsel or make you dependent on one human being's interpretation of my will. The car seemed to glow even brighter as Jesus prepared to give me the most practical wisdom. When I communicate with you, it brings peace even when the message is challenging. It increases your love for others rather than creating suspicion and isolation. It encourages your growth as an individual rather than demanding conformity to someone else's agenda. Remember this, he continued. Healthy spiritual relationships are marked by mutual respect, encouragement of individual growth, respect for boundaries, confirmation through multiple sources, and freedom to question and seek clarity. Any relationship that lacks these characteristics, no matter how spiritual it claims to be, is not from me. Jesus began to fade slightly, but his words came with the power to transform every future relationship. The freedom you feel right now isn't just liberation from Rebecca's manipulation. It's the freedom to have authentic relationships built on genuine love rather than spiritual coercion. You will use this wisdom to help countless others recognize and escape the spiritual manipulation that destroys souls while claiming to save them. People who have been trapped by pastors who demand unquestioning obedience, friends who use prophecy to control behavior, romantic partners who claim divine authority for unhealthy demands. As he prepared to leave, Jesus gave me one final piece of wisdom that would change everything. The greatest protection against spiritual manipulation is understanding that I respect your autonomy even when others don't. I invite, I don't demand. I encourage, I don't manipulate. I bring peace, I don't create confusion. Any relationship that operates differently, no matter how spiritual it appears, is not representing my heart. Remember this encounter, Jonathan, because there are millions of people trapped in toxic relationships disguised as spiritual connection. They need to hear that freedom is possible, that healthy boundaries are biblical, and that my love never manipulates, never controls, and never uses spiritual language to justify ungodly behavior. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in my car with the most liberating understanding of healthy relationships I had ever received. The confusion that had tormented me for 8 months was completely gone, replaced by crystal clear wisdom about the difference between love and manipulation, between divine guidance and human control. For the first time in months, I felt completely free to be myself without fear of disappointing someone who claimed to represent God's will for my life. I sat in my car until dawn, not because I was processing trauma, but because I was treasuring every detail of the most liberating encounter about relationships I had ever experienced. The freedom that filled me wasn't just the absence of manipulation, but the presence of crystal clear wisdom about how healthy spiritual relationships actually function. As the sun began to rise over Nashville, I realized that everything about my understanding of boundaries, love, and spiritual authority had fundamentally changed. I wasn't just someone who had escaped a toxic relationship. I was someone who now possessed the wisdom to recognize manipulation disguised as ministry and help others break free from similar spiritual abuse. Around 7:00 a.m., I called my spiritual director, Father Thomas, who I had been avoiding for months because Rebecca had gradually convinced me that his counsel was limiting what God wanted to do in my life. "Jonathan," he said with obvious relief when he heard my voice, "I've been praying for you constantly. There was something about your last few conversations that concerned me, but I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong. I spent the next 2 hours sharing everything: Rebecca's systematic manipulation, the 8 months of spiritual abuse disguised as ministry partnership, my encounter with Jesus, and the 10 truths about toxic relationships that had set me free. Father Thomas listened with growing amazement and concern. "Jonathan, what you're describing is spiritual abuse of the most sophisticated kind. I've seen this pattern destroy people's faith and emotional health when they can't recognize manipulation wrapped in religious language. What's remarkable," he continued, "is how clearly you can now see what was happening. The wisdom Jesus gave you about healthy versus toxic spiritual relationships that's going to help countless people who are trapped in similar situations." That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I reached out to friends I had been avoiding because Rebecca had convinced me they were obstacles to God's plan for my life. Their responses were immediate and telling. "Jonathan, we've been so worried about you," said my longtime friend and co-star George Xanthus. "You seemed to disappear from all of us over the past few months. We could tell something was wrong, but every time we tried to reach out, you seemed distant and defensive." Elizabeth Tabish echoed the same concern. "There was something different about you lately, like you were carrying anxiety and confusion instead of the peace we've always seen in you. We didn't know how to help because you seemed to be pulling away from everyone who cared about you." Dallas Jenkins was more direct. "Jonathan, I was actually planning to have a conversation with you about some changes I'd noticed. You seem to be questioning every decision, second-guessing your own spiritual discernment, and isolating yourself from your support system. I'm relieved to hear you've recognized what was happening." The pattern was clear. Everyone who genuinely cared about me had noticed the changes Rebecca's manipulation had created, but I had been too confused and isolated to hear their concerns. Over the next few days, as I shared my experience with trusted friends and mentors, I began to understand how common spiritual manipulation actually is. Person after person shared their own experiences with toxic relationships, disguised as ministry partnerships, prophetic guidance, or spiritual mentorship. I went through something similar with a pastor who claimed God was giving him special revelation about my life, shared one friend. "He gradually convinced me that questioning his guidance was questioning God, and it took me 2 years to realize I was being spiritually abused." Another friend described a romantic relationship where her partner used God's will to justify controlling behavior. He would say things like, "God showed me that you're being rebellious," whenever I disagreed with him. It was spiritual manipulation disguised as relationship leadership. The stories were heartbreaking but also revelatory. I realized that what had happened to me was part of a much larger pattern of spiritual abuse that was destroying lives and damaging faith while hiding behind religious language and claims of divine authority. That's when I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. Instead of delivering my planned presentation about faith and authenticity at the Nashville conference, I was going to share my experience with spiritual manipulation and the wisdom Jesus had given me about toxic relationships. "Are you sure about this?" asked the conference organizer when I explained my change in topic. "This is pretty vulnerable territory, and it might be controversial to address spiritual abuse at a Christian leadership conference." "That's exactly why it needs to be addressed," I replied. "If church leaders don't understand how to recognize and respond to spiritual manipulation, how can they protect their congregations from people who use faith as a weapon?" Standing before 800 Christian leaders from across the Southeast, I took the biggest risk of my ministry career and shared the complete truth about my 8 months of spiritual abuse and the encounter with Jesus that had set me free. For 8 months, I told the audience, I was systematically manipulated by someone who claimed to be hearing from God about my life. She used spiritual language to justify controlling behavior, isolation tactics to separate me from wise counsel, and claims of divine revelation to pressure me into decisions that served her agenda rather than God's will. The auditorium was completely silent as I detailed Rebecca's manipulation tactics and how they had gradually destroyed my confidence in my own spiritual discernment. But 11 days ago, I continued, Jesus appeared to me and gave me 10 truths about toxic relationships that not only set me free but equipped me to help others recognize the difference between healthy spiritual relationship and manipulation disguised as ministry. I shared each truth Jesus had revealed, explaining how to identify spiritual manipulation, establish healthy boundaries, and recognize authentic divine guidance versus human control wrapped in religious language. The response was overwhelming. During the break, dozens of leaders approached me, sharing their own experiences with spiritual abuse, either as victims or as witnesses to the damage caused by manipulative people in ministry positions. "I've been in church leadership for 20 years," said Pastor Michael Rodriguez, "and I've never heard anyone address this issue so clearly. We've lost countless good people who were driven away by manipulative leaders who use spiritual authority to justify ungodly behavior." Dr. Rebecca Chen, a Christian counselor, was in tears. "Jonathan, I work with clients every week who are recovering from spiritual abuse. What you've shared today, those 10 truths about toxic relationships, that's going to help me help them understand that their confusion and pain weren't caused by spiritual weakness, but by spiritual manipulation." The conference organizers extended my session by an hour because participants didn't want to leave without exploring how to protect their communities from spiritual predators and help victims of religious abuse find healing. "This might be the most important message we've ever had at this conference," said the lead organizer. "You've given us language and tools for addressing a problem that's been destroying people's faith for decades." Flying back to Los Angeles a week later, I felt like I was carrying the most valuable gift imaginable, not just personal freedom from manipulation, but wisdom that could help others recognize and escape the spiritual abuse that destroys souls while claiming to save them. The first thing I did when I got home was call Dallas Jenkins and the cast of The Chosen. I needed to share what had happened before I could return to work, because I knew it would fundamentally change how I approached any scenes dealing with authority, submission, or spiritual leadership. "Jonathan," Dallas said after I'd finished recounting the entire experience, "this is going to make your portrayal of Jesus even more authentic. You now understand firsthand the difference between spiritual authority that liberates and spiritual authority that manipulates. That's going to come through in every scene where Jesus interacts with religious leaders who use their position to control people." Elizabeth Tavish was deeply moved by the account. "There's such freedom in your voice when you talk about healthy boundaries and authentic spiritual relationships. It's like you've been set free from prison, and now you're helping others find the keys to their own cells." When we resumed filming 2 weeks later, the difference was immediately apparent. In scenes where Jesus confronted religious leaders who used their authority to burden people rather than bless them, I wasn't just reciting dialogue, I was drawing from personal experience of the damage caused by spiritual manipulation. The crew noticed the change immediately. Our director of photography mentioned that there was something more confident about my presence during those scenes, something that made Jesus's opposition to religious manipulation feel deeply personal and authentic. But the most profound change was in my ministry outside of The Chosen. Word spread quickly about my Nashville presentation, and I began receiving invitations to speak specifically about recognizing and escaping toxic spiritual relationships. Within a month, I was traveling to churches, conferences, and counseling centers, sharing what I had learned about the difference between healthy spiritual authority and manipulation disguised as ministry. At a church in Phoenix, I spoke to a congregation that had recently discovered their pastor had been using prophetic insight to manipulate members into questionable financial decisions and inappropriate personal relationships. What Jonathan is describing, the pattern of isolation, spiritual intimidation, and claims of exclusive divine revelation, that's exactly what we experienced, said Sarah Martinez, whose family had lost their savings to the pastor's divinely revealed investment scheme. We thought questioning him meant questioning God, so we ignored our own discernment and trusted his manipulation. At a women's conference in Atlanta, I addressed an audience where dozens of participants were recovering from spiritually abusive marriages where husbands had used biblical submission as justification for controlling and demeaning behavior. My ex-husband would say, "God showed me before every demand he made, shared Jennifer Thompson. He convinced me that my resistance to his control was rebellion against God's design for marriage. What you're teaching about how God actually communicates through peace and respect for free will, that's helping me understand I wasn't rebellious. I was responding to manipulation. At a Christian college in Texas, I spoke to students who were struggling with campus ministries that used spiritual pressure tactics to control behavior and demand unquestioning loyalty to human leadership. Our campus ministry leader claimed that questioning his authority was touching God's anointed, said Mark Sullivan, a senior who had left the group after recognizing manipulation tactics. Your presentation helped me understand that healthy spiritual authority welcomes questions and encourages individual relationship with God rather than demanding blind obedience to human interpretation. 6 months after my encounter with Jesus, I received an invitation that felt like the ultimate validation of the wisdom he had shared with me. Major Christian counseling organization asked me to develop a training program for therapists who work with victims of spiritual abuse. Jonathan, said Dr. Patricia Wilson, the organization's director, what you've learned about recognizing and healing from spiritual manipulation could help thousands of counselors better serve clients who've been damaged by toxic religious relationships. Most therapy training doesn't address the specific trauma caused by spiritual abuse. Working with a team of psychologists and theologians, I developed a comprehensive program that taught mental health professionals how to recognize spiritual abuse, understand its unique psychological impacts, and help victims rebuild their spiritual lives after manipulation disguised as ministry. The 10 truths Jesus shared with you, said Dr. Wilson, during our program development, provide the clearest framework I've ever seen for distinguishing between healthy spiritual relationship and religious manipulation. This is going to transform how we approach therapy for spiritual abuse survivors. 1 year after my encounter with Jesus about toxic relationships, Rebecca attempted to contact me through social media, claiming she had received new revelations about God's plan for our reconnection. Instead of feeling confused or guilty, I immediately recognized every manipulation tactic she employed. The spiritual language designed to create obligation, the claims of divine revelation that conveniently served her agenda, the guilt-inducing suggestions that my resistance was disobedience to God. I blocked her communication and shared the experience with my accountability partners, marveling at how clearly I could now see manipulation that had once trapped me for months. The difference is remarkable, observed Father Thomas. Last year, her spiritual language created confusion and guilt. Now you can immediately identify it as manipulation because you understand how God actually communicates. Today, 2 years after my encounter with Jesus, I regularly speak to audiences about recognizing and escaping toxic spiritual relationships. The message has evolved into a comprehensive teaching about healthy boundaries, authentic spiritual authority, and the difference between divine guidance and human manipulation. The 10 truths Jesus taught me about toxic relationships have become the foundation for everything I now teach about spiritual abuse and healthy boundaries. First, toxic relationships always use spiritual language to justify ungodly behavior, wrapping manipulation in claims of divine revelation. Second, toxic relationships systematically isolate you from other sources of wisdom and support, making you dependent on one person's spiritual interpretation. Third, toxic relationships create confusion rather than clarity, anxiety rather than peace, and compliance rather than growth. Fourth, toxic relationships demand immediate obedience to human interpretation rather than encouraging patient discernment of divine will. Fifth, toxic relationships use shame and guilt as primary motivational tools, while healthy relationships use love and encouragement. Sixth, toxic relationships claim exclusive access to divine revelation about your life, undermining your direct relationship with God. Seventh, toxic relationships elevate human authority over divine relationship, making you dependent on human interpretation rather than personal spiritual discernment. Eighth, toxic relationships use your spiritual desires against you, weaponizing your genuine faith to justify their ungodly demands. Ninth, toxic relationships create trauma bonds disguised as spiritual connection, using cycles of pressure and relief to create emotional dependency. 10th, toxic relationships can only trap you when you don't understand how God actually communicates through peace, respect for free will, and confirmation through multiple sources. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you're trapped in a relationship where someone uses spiritual language to control, manipulate, or isolate you, I want you to know that freedom is possible. Maybe you're in a church where questioning leadership is labeled as rebellion against God. Maybe you're in a romantic relationship where your partner claims divine authority for controlling behavior. Maybe you're in a friendship where someone uses prophetic insight to manipulate your decisions. The confusion you feel isn't spiritual weakness, it's your soul responding to manipulation. The guilt you experience when you resist isn't conviction from God, it's the result of spiritual abuse designed to override your discernment. God never manipulates. He never uses guilt or fear as primary motivational tools. He never demands immediate obedience to complex decisions. He never isolates you from wise counsel. He never makes you dependent on one person's interpretation of his will. When God communicates, it brings peace even when the message is challenging. It encourages your individual growth rather than demanding conformity. It respects your free will, even when inviting you to difficult obedience. It can be confirmed through multiple sources rather than requiring blind trust in one person's revelation. Maybe you're someone who has escaped a toxic relationship, but you're struggling with guilt about setting boundaries or fear that you're somehow disobeying God by protecting yourself from manipulation. I want you to understand that healthy boundaries are biblical, that protecting yourself from spiritual abuse is wisdom, and that God never intended for his name to be used as a weapon against your soul. Father God, I thank you for the wisdom that set me free from spiritual manipulation and equipped me to help others recognize the difference between love and control. For everyone listening who is trapped in toxic relationships disguised as spiritual connection, I pray that they would receive the same clarity that transformed my confusion into freedom. For those who are being isolated from wise counsel, help them reconnect with people who genuinely care about their well-being. For those who are being pressured to make decisions based on someone else's revelation, give them confidence in their ability to hear from you directly. For those who feel guilty for resisting manipulation, help them understand that healthy boundaries honor you rather than offend you. For those who have been convinced that questioning human authority means questioning divine authority, restore their confidence in their personal relationship with you. Help all of us to recognize that your love never manipulates, never controls, never uses spiritual language to justify ungodly behavior. Thank you for respecting our autonomy even when others don't, for inviting rather than demanding, for encouraging rather than manipulating. Protect those who are vulnerable to spiritual abuse, and raise up more people who can recognize and expose manipulation disguised as ministry. In Jesus' name, amen. The truth I learned in that Nashville parking lot is the truth that can set anyone free from spiritual manipulation and toxic relationships. God's love never controls, never manipulates, never uses spiritual language to justify ungodly behavior. You don't have to accept manipulation just because it's wrapped in religious language. You don't have to submit to control just because someone claims divine authority. You don't have to sacrifice your well-being to avoid disappointing someone who uses God's name to justify their demands. Freedom is possible, healthy boundaries are biblical, and authentic spiritual relationships honor your individual growth rather than demanding your submission to human control. Thank you for letting me share the most liberating wisdom about relationships I've ever received. I love you all, and Jesus loves you enough to set you free from anyone who uses his name to keep you trapped.